I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
It's really exciting to be here and it's great. I always love that moment when we feel like we're moving and progressing, and today is definitely one of those days. So we are moving into a new part today, part 4, but I thought it'd be a good chance for us to look back at the journey that we've been on before we launch into part 4. So Kat, help us understand the journey of where we've been. Someone first time listening maybe, part 4, they have no idea what that means. They haven't been with us for part 1, 2 or 3, or people have been tapping in and out. So we're working through a book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age, and he has written this kind of as a academic argument that the regular story of secularization, of the world becoming secular, might not be as straightforward as you think. And so he's giving us his argument point by point. So could you take us through, I guess, that first chunk of parts 1, 2 and 3?
Okay, so part 1, he calls the work of reform. Part 1 follows the story of how you go from Christendom, from an era in the West, in Europe, where just about everyone believed and it was unthinkable to not believe in God, to a point, which part 2 is about, where there becomes a more and more satisfactory alternative, at least amongst thinkers, amongst the philosophers and the academics of the world. So he tracks in the first part how this could even come to be. So the historical events that slowly just opened the cracks that allowed thinkers to move in that direction.
Yeah.
Part 2, the turning point, is really his breaking open of this viable alternative. He calls it exclusive humanism, the idea of the human person being at the center of the world, that human beings can choose and control things, that there's no need for a God in the picture, that we actually, our purpose, instead of getting over the line, getting into heaven with God, our purpose is actually just for human flourishing. And so, part 2 still follows this historically, how these convictions amongst thinkers grow and are added to and refined. But we get to part 3, which is the most recent one, and he calls it the Nova effect. And here's where his sort of argument that it's not as simple or as linear a slide from a viable alternative into a secular age as you'd think, that I think he's coming against the story that we tend to get in the world today, which is that, with the rise of a viable alternative, there's a corresponding decline, and it's very linear, of people believing, and eventually we'll get to a point where no one believes. Part 3, the Nova effect, takes a scientific phenomenon, what happens when a star dies and explodes, and applies it to help us understand or describe what happens here now that there's a viable alternative to Christianity.
It's like that old thing about when the bag of feathers gets scattered into the wind. It's like, I guess that's what he means by the turning point, right? That there's once these ideas or ways of being are in place, it's really difficult to go back to something else. And then it's like the Nova effect is each of those feathers then takes on a new life of its own kind of thing.
Absolutely. So what you get is, there's this idea, there's exclusive humanism, and then there's a pushback against it, but it's not just a pushback from faith. So there is a pushback from faith, and what you get is, over the next century or so, you get big revivals of faith where greater numbers of people return to a greater fervor of their faith. You get new alternatives of faith as the existence of unbelief pushes people out in mission in different ways and new ways of expressing their faith. But you also get a pushback amongst their own thinkers in terms of unbelief and what the world is really for and about, and whether or not we really are moving towards human flourishing, or whether there's any meaning or purpose to human existence whatsoever, whether we really are at the center of the universe. So instead of this one neat little one thing replaces another, what you get is just a growing, it's like when you drop a rock into a still pond and you get these rings that are just ever widening. If you like, the dropping of the rock of secular humanism into the still pond of Western Europe doesn't produce a neat replacement of itself, but there's these ever widening rings of response as different people grapple with what this means for them and how they're going to respond to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the images that I think some people might have of this idea of secularization is, from, say, like two trenches, and there's all these people in the middle ground, and it's, the atheists versus the people of faith. And he's kind of saying it's not like that at all. It's not two camps, it's 15,000 camps. And so we've used over and over again this idea of the marketplace. People are very free in this space to move around, and we've talked about a lot of the ethics of that. So today we begin part 4, as I was saying. So this is where we're looking at, I guess, the very increasingly quick march, I guess, to where we are today. So this chapter that we're stepping into is called The Age of Mobilization, and we won't get into exactly what that is today, maybe in the coming episodes. Today, he's kind of laying the groundwork for these narratives of secularization, and effectively, it's a key part of his argument that he's making, that I think it was one of our very first episodes, where you think you are matters, and he would kind of say in this section we're talking about today, like, what you think we're built on matters.
So yeah, this portion of this chapter is very much just a pushback against the dominant narrative that we tend to be sold in the media and the academic world, of that steady decline, steady rise, two polar kind of things happening at the same time.
So as you were saying, Kat, we've been tracking, I guess, these alternatives that were there for the few, for the elite, and how it became a viable option for the many. That, that the academics and the thinkers had these alternatives. How did they become options for the many? And in the dominant narrative, Charles Taylor says that there's two kind of things that are in place here. The first is what he calls diffusion, this idea that through increasingly widespread education, that the ideas filter through the rest of society. And also that as we get urbanization and industrialization, that the divide between city and rural is a bit diminished, and people are having more exchange, I guess, that even the people on the margins are having more exchange. So this is what he calls diffusion.
Yeah, there's something too, I think, in there about the media, that with the rise of like technology that enables us to all hear and the same things at the same time, radio, for instance, right at the beginnings, suddenly everybody's exposed to the same ideas and talking about the same ideas.
Yeah. And the second element that he says as part of this dominant narrative is differentiation. And this is where all the functions of the church or faith or religion start to be separated out into different spheres. So the example he uses is, you don't need to go to the priest for a blessing for your cows anymore, because we now have a drench that's going to work to cure the ringworms. Like, we don't need to go to God for that thing. We now have science for that thing. And so with this dominant narrative of secularization, he's saying these are two of the factors. What we're left with is, there's probably more, but 3 definite notions of how religion is viewed. I guess different approaches that people might take based on this narrative. So the first is that it's false. Religion is false, and science has proved this. The second is that religion is irrelevant. Like, now that we can cure the ringworms with a drench, all those functions that we use religion for are now irrelevant. And the third is that it's unattractive. So he says, we now value autonomy, and religion's got a lot of focus around authority. So it's quite unattractive in modernity.
That's true. If we stop and think about this, how much do you, even if you don't agree with those statements, how much do you kind of feel the familiarity of them? Like, I might not have heard it directly, but indirectly, it's fed to me all the time. And indirectly, I respond to it in the way that I'm, designing youth ministry retreats or that kind of thing. I'm helping people, if you like, respond to or be resilient against these kind of beliefs around them.
Yeah, it's true. It feels very familiar. And he uses this word of unthought in this chapter, which is great. It's, that underlying thing that we haven't even been aware that we're thinking, but it's sitting there under the current. And so to break this open, he brings in an image that I want to take a bit of time to open up, because I think it's very helpful in articulating the point he's trying to make. So he says the narrative of secularization, or theories of secularization, of what it is that secular and religion looks like today, is kind of like a building with 3 levels. So he says on the ground floor, on the very ground floor is the data. What's the actual facts? That religious faith and practice have declined. The scope of influence of religion has declined. So these base things that no matter where you are in the world, you could probably agree to some degree on, depending on how you interpret it, that this is the situation. This is how things are. There is something's happened, and we're able to look at that. And a lot of those things you can measure depending, as I said, how you do your interpretation. So then he says, beneath all of that, in the basement, is where you have the causes, the things that you place in the basement that you think are explaining what's on the ground floor. So here he has things like urbanization, migration, social fragmentation, that rise of rationalism. So all these forces at work that are trying to explain what's happening on the ground floor. Now, depending on which country you're in, I think the level above ground floor is either the second story or the first story. So let's just call it the top story, the one above ground. And this is the one that we get a lot of variance in. So maybe we have the same idea of what's in the basement and what's led to what's happening on the ground floor, but it can be interpreted very differently. And this is one of the things that Charles Taylor will say, is that we might have the same things that we're aware of that have happened, but we might interpret their influence very differently. And so we're going to get this whole scope of then what's on that top floor, the future. What's the place of religion today? And what's the end point of where we're going? So, for example, if you think that all the causes in that basement level have led to religion losing its purpose, the example of the ringworm drench, right? Then you now think that, well, there's no purpose for religion to be having those functions anymore. So we've got to find a new function for religion. And he has this quote that says, religion has to find work to do other than relating individuals to the supernatural. And that might be, for example, social justice. So if you're following that part of the narrative, you think that religion has lost its purpose, then you're trying to make religion hang around by finding something new for it to do that's still fitting in with the narrative of modernity. Or if you think it's irrelevant, if you think that religion is now irrelevant, that we don't have need for any of its purposes, and actually we can do all those things that religion used to do without it, then he's got another strain of thinkers that are thinking, well, religion's just the end point is that religion will stop being in the conversation, because you've got to care too much about religion to be irreligious. So we have people in our current age like Richard Dawkins, who are very militant atheist and have a lot of engagement with people of religion, whereas this line of thought would say, in time, the atheist won't even be called an atheist because they won't be in relation to a theist. But then there's also other avenues, and I think this is where we might look at going today of why this is important, because there's so many different ways this can be interpreted, and it's important to stay I guess, current or at least aware of what's happening in the world, because a lot of this stuff is happening and unfolding in our eyes. Like Taylor wrote this book. It's kind of feeling a bit old now, 2007. It's getting close to its 20-year anniversary. A lot has happened in those 20 years. But he's got a quote there from 94 of someone talking about we're seeing a deprivatization of religion, that some of the world religions are starting to say, hang on, we're not okay with being put in a box. And I would say, in a weird kind of way, with the increase in globalization in the last 20 years, that we're probably possibly seeing even more of that. Something like the Charlie Kirk scenario in America. We've got some particular religious wars happening in the world at the moment, even though they're beyond religion. But there's in Australia, it's a bit of a debate at the moment as well, all around religion, that what people thought was irrelevant is in some ways almost increasing in its public sphere. So it's just very fascinating, I think. And I guess Taylor's whole point in this is that you can't stay locked in, you can't stay fixed in of like, this is the story, this is the end point, because there's so many factors at play. And so I guess we're looking at, what does this mean for us today as evangelists? Maybe some good questions would be like, how would we build that house? What would we have on the ground floor? What would we consider is in the basement? And how does that impact what we see is on the top floor? But also, and I think we keep coming back to this, like, the world might say that faith is false, irrelevant, and unattractive, but I would actually say I'm encountering the exact opposite in a lot of my life and ministry at the moment.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because essentially, what he's questioning, first of all, is the conclusion people are coming to about what we're looking at in the world today. And then he's going back and saying, well, depending on what you see in the world around you today is how you then interpret what has happened and what has led to that. But just like his questioning of what people are seeing in the world today, like, it's really opened my eyes, I guess, reading what he's had to say around the nova effect and what he'll go on to talk about as the supernova effect, and this idea of so many different options for belief and unbelief. And the more I've read him and talked about it, the more I see it in the world around me, that it's just not as simple as those two different camps of belief and unbelief, but what we're dealing with in terms of mission, but what we're dealing with in the world at large, even for like politicians and lawmakers and that kind of thing, is we're looking at a world which is really quite complicated when it comes to belief.
Yes. And he has a really great part in there where he just likes to, I don't know, throw a little missile in every now and then. He kind of deconstructs a lot of things. He's like, well, what is religion? Let's talk about what religion actually is. Like, when we say there's been a decline in religion or religious belief, what are we talking about? And he said, there's a lot of different ways we can interpret what that is. And is it just about the supernatural? Is it about it having a transformational effect in your life? All these kinds of things. But then he also says, well, we should also look back to, this golden age of Christendom and think about, well, is that really, like, what did religious belief and practice actually look like then? And, is it idolized too much? Do we have a really good idea of what it is?
I think the biggest thing it's done for me is not assuming just because somebody doesn't practice their faith on the level that I do, or doesn't seem to practice any faith at all, that there's zero openness to God or faith. And in my experience, sometimes it's the people who seem furthest away that have more openness than some of the people who skirt around the edges and have all sorts of questions and hurts or that kind of thing around faith and church.
And so, leading into then, I guess, these reasons for faith, I guess working through those three, my life every day is a declaration that, God is not false and science has not disproved it. I've got a science degree, and it didn't take away my belief. Do you know what I mean? That I have seen too many things in my lifetime that defy science, really, that defy anything other than there is something more, and that something more has literally changed my life. And then if we move across to irrelevant, well, only in the last week did I catch up with someone who contacted me after 10 years away from the church saying, I watched the new Knives Out movie and something happened. Watching that movie made me think about faith again, and can we talk about it? So I don't think faith and religion are as irrelevant as the world would have to say. And even my sister-in-law grew up with no faith background at all, and we were away camping recently, and some of us were going to Sunday mass. They stayed at the campsite, but she started asking these questions of like, what's it like to go to mass? What's it like to pray? So the same thing happens at a mass every time. And just the words coming out of her mouth, like, oh, I can understand how that would be like really peaceful. I can understand how that would be really beautiful to just know what's going to happen each time. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we forget actually how attractive it is sometimes because we hear so much of the other message that the world has to give.
And even it's fascinating, I think, that third reason that Taylor gives of why people often say that faith is on the decline, which is, that the church is authoritarian and people aren't into being told what to do. I would say that, in this current, what I've called a lot on this podcast, age of anxiety, there is something really attractive about a safe space, a world where somebody's defined the boundaries and not just telling you what to do, but telling you how it is. And I would say that that's a huge part of the attractiveness of faith, particularly for young people coming into the church. And I'd say also that that's why there's a greater number of young people who are attracted then to the more traditional forms of faith, because there's something about the solidity and continuity of the same practices and the way that truth is talked about that makes people feel like they're safe and they belong to something that is stable in a world that does not feel that way most other places.
Yes, exactly. And I love we've had only one guest to date on the show, Bishop Mark Edwards, and he has this great saying around, we shouldn't want to be in any other age, I guess. So you could look at the situation today and be quite discouraged, and you could hear the dominant narrative of secularization and feel like, we're on a bullet train that's a slow decline out of faithland kind of thing. But he would say, actually, here's all our reasons for hope. Like God thought that you were perfectly suited to this time. This is why you're here. And I just find solace in that over and over again of, oh, I don't need to be discouraged. Actually, I have the whole Trinity behind me, and they've empowered me for this mission in this time, in this age. And actually, it's awesome. And I shouldn't want to be in any other time, because there's so many cool elements of what it means to be a Christian in today's world, what it means to be a missionary, being able to talk about God in the world today. And we have the gospel, which is always true. It's always relevant. It's always attractive.
I was thinking about it and thinking there's something around some of the reading and thinking I've been doing in my prayer recently around thinking about the will of God as what is right now, rather than a set of instructions that I'm waiting to drop out of the sky that I'm going to follow.
Sure.
This idea of accepting God's will as the age that He's placed me in, the particular circumstances of my life, even the chaos and complications, as part of God's will, God's choices for me. And then He's given me a freedom in working with that and responding to that. And that actually life is much easier when I stop fighting the reality that's around me and accept and embrace what's in front of me and allow myself to be shaped by it and allow myself to actively shape it with the gifts and the experience and the uniqueness of me that God has placed in the now. That, the will of God for me here and now is that I'm interacting with a world that is complicated, that I live in a supernova world where there's a million different ways of believing and not believing. And God's placed me with all my unique gifts and experience to interact with that and to grow through that. That's my road to heaven.
That's beautiful. Maybe that's a good spot for us to land today in terms of just taking some time to think about where is it that God has planted me? What has he planted me with? Who's he planted me around? What's the gift of my life to this time and this age? What's my reasons for hope in this time and age? And yeah, maybe even just allowing yourself to have that open mind to ask some questions around what do I see the end point? And is that an open end point? Like, do I have some kind of power to be an agent of hope in rather than just locked down at the end kind of thing?
There's a real freedom, I think, in that kind of hope, a freedom that I don't have to accept the story as it's being told me, but I am actually part of that story and I shape the story.
That's great. Well, thanks for the conversation today, Kat, and for all of our listeners. I hope that it's been helpful for you and that, yeah, really encourage you to continue, chat to someone during this week about something you heard, because really, I think this stuff is not just stuff you listen and take in, but we definitely are learning by talking about it. And I think it might be the same for you too. The more you apply it and talk about it, wrestle it out, I think the more we're all going to grow and learn together. So until next time, be well.
See you later.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.